Hey gang, and welcome back. So, when most people think of Spider-Man, the first thought that comes to their mind is probably your friendly neighborhood vigilante, swinging from building to building, quipping as he takes out enemies with his webs. Tell me though, how surprised would you be to hear that there's an official Spider-Man live-action TV series in which Spider-Man pilots a giant transforming robot, fights massive aliens, and even throws out attack names like anime? Doesn't seem exactly like something your average Spider-Man fan would have first been excited to see, does it? So back in 1978, Marvel had licensed Spider-Man to Japan's The Toei Company. And instead of just faithfully adapting Peter Parker's adventures, they ended up reinventing almost everything. Marvel itself describes the result as a madcap, stunt-filled TV series that gave Spider-Man its own superpowered take on the character. And the outcome of that was one of the strangest superhero shows ever made. So strange that it ended up changing the standards of Japanese television forever. Let's dig in. In the late 1970s, a 3-year licensing agreement was established between Marvel Comics and the Toei Company. Unlike other licensing deals, this one gave both companies the right to use each other's characters to create derivative works. In other words, Toei and Marvel were not obligated to localize comics in Japan. Instead, both companies could develop their own adaptations of Marvel's superheroes. Marvel later explained that the agreement gave Toei freedom to create their own project with Marvel's famous web-slinging superhero Spider-Man. The first and most popular such adaptation was the Japanese Spider-Man, a live-action television series which aired on Tokyo Channel 12, currently TV Tokyo, from May 17, 1978 to March 14, 1979. It consisted of 41 episodes and a theatrical short film. In stark contrast to the American comics and superhero movies of the time, Spider-Man was not a comic book adaptation. First of all, this superhero TV series was a typical tokusatsu, or a local equivalent of America's superhero movies and TV series. These kinds of shows are characterized by the usage of special effects such as miniatures, pyrotechnics, and wrestling. Additionally, unlike its comic counterpart, the Japanese series did not follow Peter Parker's adventures. Instead, it focused on special effects like in the Godzilla and Ultraman movies. Overall, Spider-Man was just another superhero in the long line of tokusatsu films and TV series. The Toei Company didn't want to localize Spider-Man and leave the comic book universe entirely, because it would be boring for the Japanese audience to watch a strict adaptation of Peter Parker's adventures. Hence, Toei took a risk and showed the world a completely different Spider-Man. There was almost nothing familiar about him, apart from the mask and the costume. There was no Daily Bugle, no Uncle Ben, no radioactive spider, no origin story. However, like Peter Parker, he still had his red and blue suit, could climb up buildings, and shoot webs out of his wrists. Unlike Peter Parker, the main character of this series was neither a nerd nor a photographer nor a science prodigy. His name was Takuya, and he was a young motorcycle racer whose transformation was caused not by a radioactive spider, but by an alien being. This is the first fundamental difference between the traditional hero of Spider-Man and the protagonist of the tokusatsu series. Takuya was an ordinary boy before he found himself in an unfamiliar spacecraft on Earth. But his meeting with death began when his father, a famous space archaeologist, started researching the remains of an alien ship. It was he who attracted the attention of the evil Iron Cross army led by Professor Monster. They learned about Planet Spider, whose sign was stolen by the archaeologist. Subsequently, the Iron Cross killed Takuya's father, and the boy began his quest for revenge, during which he found the alien ship in which the last warrior of Planet Spider was hiding. Further, the hero met Garaya, an inhabitant of Planet Spider, who told him the story of his own planet and revealed secret information about the Iron Cross. Having been subjected to persecution, Garaya traveled to Earth to destroy the ships of the Iron Cross, but he was mortally wounded in an attack on one of the vessels. In a dying state, he saved Takuya, transferring to him his blood and strength. Unlike Peter Parker, who received the gift of a spider bite, the young racer received amazing abilities from Garaya. The Spider Warrior transferred his knowledge to Takuya, with the help of the Spider Bracelet, thanks to which he could change into the costume of Spider-Man, shoot special spider strings, and fight the Iron Cross. In addition, the bracelet was the key to the spacecraft in which Garaya brought the boy to Earth. Thus, the hero had to fight both to avenge the murder of his father and to destroy the Iron Cross, which pursued Planet Spider and continued its attacks on Earth. As if having alien origins and powers, agility, wall crawling, and spider strings wasn't enough, in this version of the Spider-Man story, the hero also has the luxury of a heavily armed flying car at his disposal. The GP-7, a high-tech flying car owned by Takuya, can be summoned at any time by Spider-Man via the Spider Bracelet. allowing him to attack from above long before he has to engage in direct combat. It's this very openness and scale in which Spider-Man was designed to differ from the other superhero programs. Huge spectacles that took place on much broader areas than one would expect from a superhero serial. Not only is the GP7 a tool for transportation, but it's also heavily armed and often used by Takuya to attack enemy strongholds before engaging in direct combat. It's not used in every episode, but the very fact that Spider-Man can simply carpet bomb the enemy base with missiles every now and then was a revelation for me as a Western viewer. Thus, it was only natural that Spider-Man would get a cool flying car and a grappling hook he can use to impressively traverse great distances. It was less about power and more about style, whereas the domestic equivalent of Spider-Man would have to rely solely on his own power to fight much stronger foes. Takuya could at least count on his high-tech equipment to help him in his fights. Even with all the cool toys and gadgets, Spider-Man still remained Spider-Man, as the secret identity of the hero remained something he had to conceal. He did have backup in case of an emergency in the form of the Interpol Secret Intelligence Division, and he was aided several times by their agents, who were aware of Takuya's secret identity and willing to assist him against the Iron Cross Army. All of this was presented in a more extravagant and flashy manner, as it was appropriate not only for the special effects genre, but also for the local Japanese setting, as opposed to the American one. If you want to know what element made this series so different from an ordinary Spider-Man film and made it a television legend, you should look no further than Leopardon. The ship from which Gariah had arrived on Earth, named Marveler, could transform into a giant robot to take Takuya into battle. The series ceased to be an ordinary superhero show about a spider, and it became something bigger, turning to increasingly epic battles. Takuya's bracelet could control the spaceship, which transformed into a giant mecha called Leopardon. Putting a giant robot in the hands of Spider-Man was the boldest reinvention of the character, which stuck to the very end of the series and made the most significant impression to the audience. Leopardon was one of the most critical plot elements for the series, as the robot fought the most massive and fearsome monsters that the Iron Cross Army could create. In most episodes, Spider-Man had to face the latest monsters from the Iron Cross Army, and the hero had to rely on tactics and brainpower to beat them, since Spider-Man's powers aren't enough to destroy something as massive as a building. Nevertheless, this was unacceptable for the Japanese television producers. So, every episode ceased to be a small monster confrontation, and the robot Leopardon transformed from Marveler, which had come to take Takuya to the battlefield. Although the robot was indeed gigantic and frightening, Spider-Man was still the main hero, having to go through many troubles even when Leopardon took most of the blows. Nevertheless, when the time came to deliver the final blow, Spider-Man used his own powers and the robot's skillful mechanism, the Sword Vigor, to kill the monster. The fact that this series didn't lose its appeal after introducing such a giant robot was colossal, but it wasn't the most impressive thing. Before Spider-Man, there wasn't a single superhero serial or movie in which the hero could pilot a giant robot into battle. Therefore, the creators of Spider-Man didn't only make a series different from the existing ones, but also presented the world with something new. Another confirmation of Spider-Man's uniqueness is that these battles are what made children want to watch these series. Toys based on it, including robot figures, were the most sought after. So Toei began to develop this concept further and released the 1979 series Battle Fever J, which gave rise to the Super Sentai franchise. This franchise is still popular in Japan and was licensed for adaptation in English-speaking countries as Power Rangers. One of the most defining and unique elements of Power Rangers, the final boss fights using giant weapons and robots, was taken directly from Spider-Man. Just as the first superhero was not like Peter Parker, the villains were nothing like Spider-Man's established rogues gallery. Unlike the Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, or the Vulture, Takuya has to fight an entire alien organization called the Iron Cross Army. This army was led by the villainous Professor Monster, one of the two most powerful antagonists in the series, and one of the best examples of the show's unique monsters. Professor Monster wanted to conquer the Earth, which he almost managed to do a couple times. He was a smart and vicious alien who avoided direct fights with the hero, as he had underlings willing to fight Spider-Man and overpower him. The villain with the code name of Professor Monster had an entire army at his command, which is necessary to defeat the hero and his allies. This army was ruled over by the absolutely monstrous Amazoness, one of the two most powerful villains in the series. She was tasked with leading legions of monsters and fighting Spider-Man in direct combat, which she could do effortlessly most of the time. Amazoness was exceptionally powerful and was often forced to fight the hero because of her combat skills and power level, placing her second in command of the villainous Iron Cross Army. The notable villainess also stood out for her appearance, as her design was instantly recognizable. Although the villains of the Iron Cross army may have had ridiculous names, they were not chaotic as one may think. As the army, controlled by Professor Monster and led by Amazonas, was an organized hierarchy in which the two leaders were at the top. Below them were their underlings, who in turn commanded regular armies of soldiers and monsters. By this point, I assume it's fairly obvious that this had very little to do with Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's creation. Aside from the red and blue color scheme and Spider-Man's wall-crawling and web-shooting powers, this series didn't have much else in common with it. This series had a different protagonist who didn't gain his powers from a radioactive spider bite, different allies, different antagonists, and a tone more akin to a Japanese action series than a Marvel comic book. They barely used any material from the comics besides Spider-Man's appearance and ability set as the basis for their own creation, making this a uniquely Japanese interpretation of a Marvel character on its own. And while this series was an arguably localized interpretation of Spider-Man, it was no less interesting or unique, especially due to the constraints it had to work with as a production. Namely, if one were to compare this to the kinds of spectacle superhero serials have to offer these days, this series' effects budget was incredibly minuscule. Practical effects, stunts, and scale models were the norm. When the real-life Leopardon suit was frequently damaged and proved difficult to maneuver on set, the production team couldn't afford to make another one. They had to resort to using old stock footage every time they needed to depict it on camera, which eagle-eyed viewers tended to notice. However, this doesn't detract from the sheer spectacle the episodes represent, with the amount of fights and stunts it was able to feature being notable, as were the special effects for the time period. Of particular note was the effect of Spider-Man crawling on walls, which was genuinely special, and the athleticism of the Spider-Man actor who managed to lend a certain degree of uniqueness to the otherwise recycled physical design of the suit. Although it wouldn't bring them any profit, it was an intriguing experiment, which was memorable enough to at least receive an official mention in the comics for the Spider-Verse crossover issue in 2014, over 30 years later. The reason why we would want to use it, ironically enough, would be the foreign appeal, as it would seem that in one of the other Spider-Man cartoons that was created around that same time, the weird little creature that Takuya had created was fondly remembered as being strangely cute. Almost 50 years after its initial airing, Japanese Spider-Man found new viewers through the internet, where both the episodes and edits resurfaced. The most popular clip was the transformation of Leopardon, which made many realize that there actually was a Japanese Spider-Man who had a transforming robot, making it arguably the silliest Japanese superhero show. This clip unintentionally gave new life to the series, as those who watched it became interested. Japanese Spider-Man was indeed able to reach a whole new audience, which was also facilitated by its inclusion in the Marvel's 616 documentary on Disney+. Moreover, it's noteworthy that compared to other Japanese shows, Spider-Man wasn't so bizarre, as it depicted international goodwill and cooperation. First, the show was so different and unique that it prepared the ground for the mecha genre, now popular in Japan. Secondly, one could see the direct influence of Japanese Spider-Man on the Super Sentai and Power Rangers television series. Therefore, although being only a small part of Japanese culture, Japanese Spider-Man introduced the West to a new genre of entertainment. It seems this is the most plausible reason for the legacy of the series, which we can't refute. Looking back, it becomes apparent that the entire point of the series was to demonstrate that most adaptations were inaccurate to their originals. However, it became a cult classic and continued its legacy in pop culture history as one of the most notable examples of an adaptation that attempted to change most of the significant elements and, in some ways, was more popular than the prototype. It took several years for the Japanese Spider-Man to become available for viewing in the West. In the meantime, diehard fans that desperately wanted to see their beloved hero had to watch pirated VHS copies or subtitled episodes at special events. The adaptation that barely saw the light of day, surrounded by the complicated relationships between the companies, is remembered today for the craze that it sparked, becoming a staple of pop culture history for 2 countries. So, in conclusion, Japan's Spider-Man was unable to save New York City and Aunt May, but instead battled villains in a skyscraper-sized robot, which eventually, ironically, made him even more popular. It wasn't some dead-end canceled project unearthed by curious fans, but instead an influential TV series that later defined the mecha genre for decades to come, while also providing a formula for the Super Sentai and Power Rangers series. In other words, an unassuming experiment with properties owned by Marvel and the Toei Company resulted in a media franchise that's both defined a genre category and given the superhero genre a new lease on life. But now the question remains, what other bizarre international superhero adaptations are waiting to be uncovered? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one, and as always, stay marvelous.